There are certain names in human history that carry a weight unlike any other. Names that, the moment they are spoken, split a room directly down the middle. Names that make some people cheer and others groan. Names that carry with them an entire universe of emotion, admiration, anger, loyalty, contempt, fascination, and disbelief, all at once, all in one breath. And then there is that name. That one name that has dominated headlines, divided households, and reshaped the entire landscape of American politics, business, and culture for decades. Donald Trump. Say it out loud anywhere in the world. In a taxi in London, at a market in Dubai, in a diner in rural Ohio, in a university hallway in Tokyo. It doesn't matter where you are. The moment those two words leave your lips, every single person in earshot is going to have something to say. Because Donald Trump is not simply a person. He is a phenomenon. He is a storm in human form. A figure so complex, so contradictory, so relentlessly controversial, that entire libraries could be filled with books trying to explain him, and still, not one of them would tell the complete story. He is a man who was born into money but still found a way to go spectacularly broke. A man who rebuilt his empire not once, but multiple times. A man who became one of America's most recognizable television celebrities, and then, as if that was not enough, decided to run for the highest office on the planet. A man who won the presidency of the United States without ever having held a single elected office before. A man who was impeached twice, convicted in a court of law, survived an assassination attempt on a campaign stage. And then, in a moment that left the entire world speechless, he came back and won the presidency again. That is not a movie script. That is not fiction. That is the real, documented, extraordinary, deeply complicated life of Donald John Trump. Now, before we go any further, understand something clearly. This documentary is not here to cheer for the man or tear him down. It is not a campaign ad, and it is not a hit piece. It is a genuine, honest, unflinching attempt to understand one of the most consequential figures in modern history. To trace the thread from a boy in Queens to a businessman in Manhattan to a television star in front of millions to a president standing before the entire world. Not once, but twice. So take a breath, clear your mind, and let us go back to the very beginning. To a borough of New York City. To a family that had everything to prove. To a boy who was never, ever going to be satisfied with ordinary. The year is 1946. World War II has just ended. Europe is in ruins. Soldiers are coming home. America is exhaling for the first time in years. There is an energy in the country, a desperate, hopeful, restless energy. The energy of a nation that survived something almost unsurvivable and now wants to build, grow, and dream again. And in the middle of all of that, on June 14, 1946, at Jamaica Hospital Medical Center in Queens, New York, a baby boy was born. His name was Donald John Trump. He came into the world as the fourth of 5 children born to Frederick Christ Trump and Mary and McLeod Trump. Now, to understand Donald, you have to understand where he came from. And where he came from is a story that begins long before his own birth. His grandfather, Friedrich Trump, arrived in America in the late 1800s as a young German immigrant with very little to his name. He worked. He scrimped. He scraped together whatever he could. And by the time he had a family of his own, he had laid the earliest foundations of what would one day become the Trump name. It was not glamorous. It was not grand. But it was a start. And in the Trump family, a start was always treated as something sacred. Donald's father, Fred Trump, took that start and ran with it. Fred was sharp, disciplined, methodical, and relentlessly hardworking. He built affordable housing for working-class families in Brooklyn and Queens. His buildings were not flashy. They were not luxury skyscrapers with gold-plated lobbies. But they were solid. They were profitable. And they made Fred Trump a wealthy and respected man in the world of New York real estate. Donald's mother, Mary Ann, was a different kind of inspiration entirely. She came from the island of Lewis, off the coast of Scotland, a place of rugged coastlines and deeply rooted people. She arrived in America as a young woman with almost nothing and worked her way into New York society through sheer determination. There was always said to be in Mary and Trump a fascination with grandeur, a love of elegance and spectacle that she passed on to her youngest son in full measure. The Trump family lived in Jamaica Estates, an upscale neighborhood in Queens. They had a large house, a chauffeur, a maid. The children went to private school. This was not poverty. This was privilege. But it was a very specific kind of privilege, privilege wrapped in expectation. Privilege that came with conditions. You were expected to be tough. You were expected to compete. You were expected to win. Fred Trump was not a warm and gentle father in the conventional sense. He was demanding. He was hard. He believed that softness was a liability and that toughness was the only real currency in life. He raised his children with iron discipline, always telling them to be competitors, to be warriors, to be winners. Of all his children, that message landed most deeply in Donald. From a very young age, Donald Trump was a handful. He was loud. He was energetic. He was bold in a way that made adults uncomfortable. He pushed boundaries before he even fully understood what boundaries were. He argued. He challenged. He refused to simply sit still and accept the world as it was handed to him. His father once recalled that Donald was a pretty rough fellow when he was small, and that was said with a mixture of frustration and, if you listen closely, a quiet kind of pride. But there was also a shadow in the Trump household, a shadow that shaped Donald in ways that are harder to see, but just as important to understand. Donald had an older brother named Fred, whom the family called Freddie. Freddie was everything that the Trump world demanded: good-looking, charming, popular. But Freddie did not fit the mold of the hard-driving Trump businessman. He had a gentler spirit. He became an airline pilot, which was not the path his father had mapped out for him. And he struggled. Freddie Trump battled alcoholism for years, and he died in 1981 at just 43 years old. The loss of Freddie left a mark on Donald that never fully healed. To this day, Donald Trump is famously, fanatically, abstemious when it comes to alcohol. He has never had a drink in his adult life. And when asked why, the answer is always the same. Freddie, his brother, his warning, his reminder that even in a family as tough and driven as the Trumps, life could still unravel in the most heartbreaking of ways. That grief, that quiet, lifelong sobriety, that is a window into something real in Donald Trump. Something human and raw that all the gold and all the glamour cannot cover up. By the time Donald Trump reached his early teenage years, it was clear to everyone around him that he needed something the regular school system was simply not equipped to give him. He needed structure that matched his intensity. He needed challenge that matched his ambition. He needed to be somewhere that would take all of that restless, combustible energy and forge it into something useful. And so his parents made a decision. They enrolled him at the New York Military Academy. At the age of 13, Donald Trump arrived at the New York Military Academy, located in Cornwall-on-Hudson, about 60 miles north of New York City. It was a place of uniforms and drills, of early mornings and strict authority, of competition and hierarchy, and discipline measured in inches. For many boys, military school is a punishment, a grim, joyless exile from the comforts of home. But for Donald Trump, something remarkable happened. He thrived. He absolutely thrived. The structure of military school did not crush his spirit. Instead, it gave his spirit a channel. The competition did not break him. It sharpened him. For the first time in his life, he was in an environment that actually matched his own intensity, and he rose to dominate it. He became a star athlete at the academy, excelling in baseball in particular. There were scouts who came to watch him play. By some accounts, he had the genuine talent to pursue professional baseball if he had chosen that path. He was popular. He was respected. He was not just a student at the New York Military Academy. He was a presence. By the time Donald Trump reached his early teenage years, it was clear to everyone around him that he needed something the regular school system was simply not equipped to give him. He needed structure that matched his intensity. He needed challenge that matched his ambition. He needed to be somewhere that would take all of that restless, combustible energy and forge it into something useful. And so his parents made a decision. They enrolled him at the New York Military Academy. At the age of 13, Donald Trump arrived at the New York Military Academy, located in Cornwall-on-Hudson, about 60 miles north of New York City. It was a place of uniforms and drills, of early mornings and strict authority, of competition and hierarchy, and discipline measured in inches. For many boys, military school is a punishment, a grim, joyless exile from the comforts of home. But for Donald Trump, something remarkable happened. He thrived. He absolutely thrived. The structure of military school did not crush his spirit. Instead, it gave his spirit a channel. The competition did not break him. It sharpened him. For the first time in his life, he was in an environment that actually matched his own intensity, and he rose to dominate it. He became a star athlete at the academy, excelling in baseball in particular. There were scouts who came to watch him play. By some accounts, he had the genuine talent to pursue professional baseball if he had chosen that path. He was popular. He was respected. He was not just a student at the New York Military Academy. He was a presence. Think about what that tells you. While his classmates were building the social networks and friendships of early adulthood, Donald Trump was already operating. He was already in the field. He was already, in every real sense that mattered, working. The hunger was that deep. The ambition was that consuming. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School in May of 1968 with a Bachelor of Science in Economics. He was 22 years old, educated at one of the finest business schools in the country, carrying his father's work ethic and his mother's sense of grandeur, burning with an ambition that Queens could no longer contain. He was ready, and Manhattan had no idea what was coming. Think about what that tells you. While his classmates were building the social networks and friendships of early adulthood, Donald Trump was already operating. He was already in the field. He was already, in every real sense that mattered, working. The hunger was that deep. The ambition was that consuming. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School in May of 1968 with a Bachelor of Science in Economics. He was 22 years old, educated at one of the finest business schools in the country, carrying his father's work ethic and his mother's sense of grandeur, burning with an ambition that Queens could no longer contain. He was ready, and Manhattan had no idea what was coming. Think about what that tells you. While his classmates were building the social networks and friendships of early adulthood, Donald Trump was already operating. He was already in the field. He was already, in every real sense that mattered, working. The hunger was that deep. The ambition was that consuming. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School in May of 1968 with a Bachelor of Science in Economics. He was 22 years old, educated at one of the finest business schools in the country, carrying his father's work ethic and his mother's sense of grandeur, burning with an ambition that Queens could no longer contain. He was ready, and Manhattan had no idea what was coming. Think about what that tells you. While his classmates were building the social networks and friendships of early adulthood, Donald Trump was already operating. He was already in the field. He was already, in every real sense that mattered, working. The hunger was that deep. The ambition was that consuming. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School in May of 1968 with a Bachelor of Science in Economics. He was 22 years old, educated at one of the finest business schools in the country, carrying his father's work ethic and his mother's sense of grandeur, burning with an ambition that Queens could no longer contain. He was ready, and Manhattan had no idea what was coming. Think about what that tells you. While his classmates were building the social networks and friendships of early adulthood, Donald Trump was already operating. He was already in the field. He was already, in every real sense that mattered, working. The hunger was that deep. The ambition was that consuming. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School in May of 1968 with a Bachelor of Science in Economics. He was 22 years old, educated at one of the finest business schools in the country, carrying his father's work ethic and his mother's sense of grandeur, burning with an ambition that Queens could no longer contain. He was ready, and Manhattan had no idea what was coming. Here is a truth about wealth built on debt. When the economy shifts, the reckoning arrives with terrifying speed. The late 1980s had been extraordinary, but by 1990, the American economy had slipped into a recession. The real estate market, which had been soaring for years, crashed. Properties that had been worth fortunes were now worth fractions of what they had sold for. Banks that had been handing out loans with almost reckless enthusiasm were now calling those loans in. And Donald Trump, who had borrowed enormous sums to fuel his dizzying expansion, suddenly found himself staring at a financial reality that was impossible to ignore. His debt load was staggering. By some accounts, the total was close to $5 billion. Nearly $1 billion of that was personally guaranteed by Trump himself. The banks were worried. The creditors were circling. And the man whose name was synonymous with success was facing something that had never happened to him in quite this way before. Failure. Real, undeniable, public, humiliating failure. The Atlantic City casinos began to buckle under the weight of their debt. The Trump Taj Mahal, which had been celebrated as the greatest casino in the world when it opened, filed for bankruptcy protection in 1991. The Trump Plaza Hotel filed for bankruptcy protection in 1992. The Plaza Hotel, that crown jewel on Central Park South, fell out of his hands. The airline was gone. The yacht was sold. The press, which had spent a decade celebrating him, turned on him with a ferocity that was almost personal. The man who had once been lauded as a genius was now the subject of mockery. Late-night hosts made him the punchline of jokes. Business publications ran stories about his recklessness, his overreach, his inability to manage what he had built. His personal life, the messy, very public end of his marriage to Ivana, his tabloid-ready relationship with actress Marla Maples. All of it played out on the front pages of every newspaper in the city, added layers of drama that only deepened the sense of a man whose world was coming apart at the seams. At one point, according to people who were close to him in those years, Trump was walking down Fifth Avenue in New York City with Marla Maples, and they passed a homeless man sitting on the sidewalk outside. And Trump looked at that man and reportedly said, "That man is worth $800 million more than me." Because at least the homeless man had nothing. Trump had negative $800 million. Whether that story is perfectly accurate or not, and Trump himself has told versions of it, the emotional truth of it is real. He was broke, not just financially stretched, genuinely, deeply, catastrophically broke. The banks were controlling his spending. He had to get approval to buy a simple suit. The empire of gold had crumbled. And yet, in the darkest moment of that financial nightmare, something about Donald Trump refused to completely break. Something in him, that stubborn, unshakable, almost irrational refusal to accept defeat, held on. He did not flee the country. He did not disappear from public life. He did not quietly slink away and accept that the story was over. He started negotiating. The comeback of Donald Trump from the financial ruins of the early 1990s is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most remarkable stories in American business history. It was not fast. It was not elegant. It was grinding, difficult, sometimes humiliating work done one deal at a time, one renegotiation at a time, one careful strategic move at a time. But it happened. Trump's first and most critical skill in those dark years was negotiation. He understood the law. He understood bankruptcy protection not as a shameful last resort, but as a legitimate legal tool, a way to restructure debt, buy time, and keep the core of the empire alive while the periphery burned away. He filed for corporate bankruptcy multiple times across his various casino and hotel businesses. And each time, he used the process to preserve what mattered most: the Trump name, Trump Tower, and the foundation on which he could eventually rebuild. He protected his personal brand with a ferocity that his creditors actually respected, even as they frustrated him. The banks, for all their frustration with him, had made a calculated decision that they were better off keeping Trump involved in his own properties than trying to manage them without him. His name was the brand. Without Donald Trump, the Trump properties were just buildings. With him, they were something else entirely. Slowly, painfully, the situation began to stabilize, then improve, then accelerate. He sold properties strategically. He renegotiated interest rates. He brought in investors. He converted debt into equity arrangements that gave him breathing room. And all the while, he was formulating a new model for the next chapter of his career, one that was smarter, leaner, and far less dependent on borrowed money. The key insight of this new chapter was branding. Pure, powerful, relentless branding. Trump realized in those difficult years that the most valuable thing he owned was not any single building or casino or hotel. It was 4 letters, Trump. His name, his identity, his brand. And that brand could be licensed. It could be placed on properties he didn't even own, on products he didn't even manufacture, on ventures he didn't personally finance. Developers around the world would pay significant sums simply to have the Trump name attached to their projects, because that name still meant something to millions of people. Trump hotels, Trump golf courses, Trump Soho, Trump International. The name went on to buildings in cities from New York to Las Vegas to Panama to the Philippines to Turkey. He was selling the brand more than the bricks. And it worked in ways that even surprised him. By the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, Donald Trump was back. Not quietly back, not cautiously back, but emphatically, loudly, goldiniously back. The man who had been written off as finished was on the covers of magazines again. His real estate portfolio was growing again. His net worth, which had been catastrophically negative, was climbing back into positive territory and accelerating. He had done the impossible. He had come back from nothing. And he had done it on his own terms. But even with all of that, even with the rebuilt empire and the recovered reputation, something was still missing. Something that no real estate deal could provide. An audience. A stage. A platform that reached not just the boardrooms of New York, but the living rooms of the entire country. And then, in 2004, he found exactly that. The year is 2003. Reality television is exploding across America. Survivor, Big Brother, American Idol. The format is simple. Put real people in extraordinary situations, film what happens, and let America vote or watch the drama unfold. Audiences are devouring it. Networks are scrambling for the next big concept. And someone at NBC had an idea. What if the premise was business? What if the competition was for a job, a real, paying, prestigious job, working for one of America's most famous businessmen? What if the businessman was Donald Trump? The Apprentice premiered on NBC on January 8, 2004. And within the first episode, it was clear that something culturally significant was happening. The format was compelling in its simplicity. A group of aspiring business people, some college-educated, some street-smart self-made entrepreneurs, would compete in weekly business challenges. They would be divided into teams. They would pitch, sell, negotiate, manage, and strategize. And at the end of every episode, the losing team would march into a boardroom where Donald Trump sat at the head of a long conference table, flanked by his advisors, and someone would be eliminated. With 3 words that became instantly, permanently embedded in American culture. You're fired. Those 2 words, delivered with a pointing finger and an expression of absolute authority, became one of the most recognizable catchphrases in the history of American television. Children said it on playgrounds. Office workers said it as a joke around the water cooler. The phrase was printed on T-shirts and coffee mugs and novelty items and Halloween costumes. Donald Trump had become a character. The character. The ultimate boss. The man who made decisions with no hesitation, no apology, and no second-guessing. In a country that had always romanticized the self-made businessman, Trump on The Apprentice was the perfect fantasy. He was powerful. He was decisive. He was entertaining in ways that were impossible to predict. The show was a massive hit. It regularly drew tens of millions of viewers per episode in its early seasons. It was nominated for Emmy Awards. It launched careers for several of its contestants. And it did something for Donald Trump that no amount of business success or media coverage had quite managed to do. It made him beloved, not universally, but broadly. Not just by the business elite or the New York social scene, but by ordinary Americans watching television in small towns and suburbs and apartments across the country. He was no longer just a name on a building. He was a face in your living room, a familiar presence, an entertainment. He appeared on the show for 14 seasons, a run that by any television standard is extraordinary. He hosted. He produced. He was the center of gravity around which everything else orbited. And the entire time, the Trump brand was being beamed into millions of American homes, week after week, building a recognition and a familiarity that would one day become the foundation of something nobody in television expected. A presidential campaign. The idea of Donald Trump running for president was not new when he finally announced his candidacy in 2015. He had flirted with the idea publicly for years, as far back as 1987, when he took out full-page newspaper advertisements commenting on American foreign policy. He tested the waters for a presidential run in 2000. He was talked about seriously in 2012, but each time he pulled back. The timing never felt quite right. But 2015 was different. America was different. The country was boiling with a frustration that the political establishment had completely failed to see, understand, or address. 8 years of the Obama administration had left a significant portion of the country feeling unheard. The economy had recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. Yes, but the recovery had been deeply uneven. The wealthy and educated had bounced back quickly. But in the heartland of America, in the factory towns of Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, in the rural communities that had once been the backbone of American industry, the story was completely different. Jobs had vanished. Factories had closed. Opioids were killing people in numbers that the rest of the country wasn't watching closely enough. And Washington, with its polished senators and carefully focused group talking points, felt like it was on a different planet. Into that landscape stepped Donald Trump. On June 16, 2015, he rode a golden escalator down from the upper floors of Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, walked to a podium in the marble lobby of his own building, and told the world he was running for president of the United States. The political world laughed. The analysts laughed. The pundits laughed. The rival campaigns laughed. This was a joke, they said. This was a publicity stunt. This was a reality TV star with a comb-over and a catchphrase. He would be gone by August. By September, certainly. The serious candidates, the governors, the senators, the people who had spent their lives preparing for this moment, would sweep him aside without breaking a sweat. They were wrong. With a catastrophic, historic, career-ending completeness, they were wrong. Because what the establishment didn't understand, what the analysts in their expensive Washington offices could not compute, was that to the millions of Americans who were angry and forgotten and fed up, Trump's lack of political experience was not a disqualification. It was the point. He was not one of them. He had not spent 30 years in the Senate making promises he never kept. He had not attended the right donor dinners or used the right careful, bloodless political language. He said exactly what was on his mind, without filtering, without softening, without a single moment of the practiced ambiguity that professional politicians spend their careers perfecting. And when he said, in that announcement speech, that he would build a wall on the southern border, and when he said that he would put America first in trade deals, and when he promised to tear up the agreements and shake up the system that had been failing regular Americans for decades, people listened. Not everyone, not the majority, initially, but enough people. The right people, in the right states, at the right moment. The Republican primary of 2016 was supposed to be a contest among serious, experienced candidates. There were 17 of them in total: governors, senators, a former vice presidential nominee, a celebrated neurosurgeon, a highly successful businesswoman. Any one of them, by conventional political logic, should have been able to dispatch a reality television star with no political experience within a few weeks. What actually happened was something political historians will be studying and debating for the rest of their careers. Trump dismantled that field one candidate at a time with a combination of relentless media attention, an almost supernatural instinct for what his audience wanted to hear, and a willingness to say things that no other candidate would dream of saying in public. He gave his opponents nicknames that stuck like burrs. Low Energy Jeb, Little Marco, Lion Ted. The names were juvenile, many observers said. beneath the dignity of presidential campaigning. But dignity, it turned out, was not what a significant portion of the American electorate was shopping for. They were shopping for someone who fought, someone who punched back, someone who didn't play by the rules that the establishment had written to protect itself. His rallies were unlike anything American politics had seen in living memory. They were events in the purest sense of the word. Crowds of tens of thousands would pack arenas and fairgrounds and convention centers. They would wait for hours in lines stretching for blocks. And when Trump walked out, to the blaring soundtrack of big, soaring, triumphant music, the energy in those rooms was something you could physically feel. It was loud and raw and electric and completely unlike the carefully staged, scripted performances of traditional political rallies. He won primary after primary, state after state, and by the summer of 2016, the unthinkable had happened. Donald J. Trump was the Republican nominee for President of the United. His opponent in the general election was Hillary Clinton, former First Lady, former Senator from New York, former Secretary of State. In terms of sheer political experience and establishment support, there was no comparison. Clinton had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment. She had the infrastructure, the donors, the endorsements, the ground game. She was, by every conventional metric, the overwhelming favorite to win. The polls said she would win. The analysts said she would win. The major newspapers endorsed her in historic numbers. The betting markets had her odds at more than 80% on election night. And then the votes started to come in. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, states that had voted Democratic in presidential elections for decades. States that Clinton's campaign had largely taken for granted. They turned red, one after another, in what felt to much of the watching world like a slow-motion earthquake. The electoral map that everyone thought they understood was rewriting itself in real time. And at approximately 2:30 in the morning of November 9, 2016, the Associated Press called it. Donald John Trump, the 70-year-old New York real estate developer and television star, with no prior government or military experience of any kind, had been elected the 45th President of the United States of America. He was the first person ever elected to the U.S. presidency without any previous government or military experience. The world did not know whether to laugh, cry, cheer, or simply stand in silence trying to process what had just happened. But it had happened. It was real. And on January 20th, 2017, Donald Trump stood on the steps of the United States Capitol, raised his right hand, and took the oath of office. America had a new president, and the world held its breath. From the very first moment of his presidency, Donald Trump made it unmistakably clear that this was not going to be a conventional administration. He had not run as a conventional candidate. He had not governed himself as a conventional businessman. And he was absolutely not going to govern as a conventional president. The pace of his first term was relentless and disorienting. Executive orders came in waves. Cabinet members were hired and fired at a speed that left Washington's political machinery spinning. Tweet storms erupted in the middle of the night. Policies were announced at rallies before they were briefed to the agencies responsible for implementing them. The White House communications operation was in a state of near-constant chaos. And yet, beneath all of that noise and disruption, things were actually happening. Significant things. He signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act into law in December 2017, the largest overhaul of the American tax code in decades. His supporters called it a historic achievement that put money back in the pockets of American workers and businesses. His critics argued that it primarily benefited corporations and the wealthy. He appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court of the United States: Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. 3 justices in a single term is historically significant, and it reshaped the ideological balance of the nation's highest court in ways that will reverberate for a generation. For many conservatives, this alone made the entire Trump presidency worthwhile. He pursued an aggressive trade policy, imposing tariffs on goods from China and renegotiating major trade agreements. The trade war with China generated enormous controversy and genuine economic pain in some sectors. but it also reflected a shift in American trade policy that represented something many voters had been demanding for decades. On the foreign policy front, his administration moved the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a decision that previous presidents had promised and never delivered. He brokered normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab nations. He met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, becoming the first sitting American president to do so, a moment that was either a breakthrough in diplomacy or a dangerous legitimization of a brutal regime, depending on whom you asked. And then, in early 2020, everything changed. The coronavirus pandemic arrived with the force of a historical rupture. The entire world was upended. And in America, the pandemic became the defining event of Trump's presidency and the defining fault line of his legacy. His handling of the pandemic was, to put it mildly, contested. He initially downplayed its severity. He contradicted public health officials on issues like masks and testing. His press briefings became daily spectacles of confusion and conflict. Critics argued that his administration's early response cost tens of thousands of lives. But on the other side of the ledger, his administration launched Operation Warp Speed, an extraordinary public-private partnership that threw the full resources of the American government behind the development of coronavirus vaccines. The result was the development and distribution of multiple highly effective vaccines in less than a year, a scientific achievement that by any fair accounting was genuinely remarkable. The debate about his pandemic response, what he did right, what he got catastrophically wrong, and what the final balance sheet of his handling looks like, continues to this day and will for decades to come. By the time he left office after losing the 2020 presidential election to former Vice President Joe Biden, Trump's first term was largely defined by scandal, investigation, and intense partisan division. Both supporters and critics often used the word unprecedented to describe his time in office. No honest account of the Trump presidency can avoid the controversies. They were not occasional. They were not incidental. They were structural, woven into the fabric of his time in office in ways that made them impossible to separate from the story itself. From the earliest days of his administration, Trump was under investigation. The Russia investigation, led by special counsel Robert Mueller, consumed the first 2 years of his presidency. It examined whether the Trump campaign had coordinated with Russian efforts to interfere in the 2016 election. Mueller's final report produced guilty pleas and convictions for several Trump associates, but did not establish that Trump himself had criminally conspired with Russia. Trump declared complete exoneration. His critics argued the report documented deeply troubling behavior, even if it fell short of criminal conspiracy. Then came the first impeachment. On December 18, 2019, Trump was impeached by the House of Representatives. The charges centered on his dealings with Ukraine, allegations that he had pressured the Ukrainian government to investigate his political rival Joe Biden in exchange for military aid. The Senate trial resulted in acquittal. Trump emerged from it angrier and more combative than before. His relationship with the American press was unlike anything the country had seen from a sitting president. He waged open, sustained, personal war against major media organizations, labeling unfavorable coverage as fake news and singling out individual reporters by name. The press fired back with equal aggression. It was not a disagreement about policy. It was a total war about reality itself, about who got to define facts, what journalism was for, and whether the traditional watchdog relationship between the press and power still meant anything. And then came the 2020 election, and the aftermath that will mark his presidency forever. When the votes were counted and Joe Biden was declared the winner, Donald Trump refused to accept the result. He claimed, without providing credible evidence, that the election had been stolen through widespread fraud. His legal team filed lawsuit after lawsuit, in state after state, before judge after judge, including judges he himself had appointed. Every single one of those legal challenges was rejected. Multiple audits in contested states confirmed the results. His own Attorney General, William Barr, publicly stated that there was no evidence of widespread fraud sufficient to change the outcome. None of it moved Trump. And on January 6, 2021, the situation reached its most dramatic and disturbing moment. Trump addressed a large crowd of supporters gathered in Washington near the White House. He urged them to march to the Capitol, where Congress was gathered to certify the Electoral College results. What followed was one of the most shocking events in the history of American democracy. A mob stormed the United States Capitol. They broke through windows and doors. They overwhelmed law enforcement. They occupied the floors and corridors of a building that represented the very foundation of American self-governance. The certification was interrupted. Members of Congress were evacuated or hid behind barricaded doors. 5 people died in connection with the events of that day. 1 week after the events of January 6th, Trump was impeached for a second time, making him the only U.S. president to have been impeached twice by the House of Representatives. This time he was charged with incitement of insurrection or encouraging mob violence against the government. The Senate held a trial, but the final tally fell 10 votes shy of conviction. Had the vote succeeded, lawmakers could have banned him from future government service. By avoiding conviction, Trump was free to run for office again in 2024. And the legal battles were far from over after he left office. In May 2024, Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. The case stemmed from evidence that he booked Michael Cohen's hush money payments to adult film actress Stormy Daniels as business expenses to cover up his alleged affair with Daniels during the 2016 election. Trump was also the first U.S. president to be a felon. But here is the extraordinary, almost unbelievable coda to all of that. Despite the impeachments, despite the criminal conviction, despite the civil judgments, despite everything, Donald Trump ran for president again. And he won. After leaving the White House in January 2021, the conventional wisdom was absolute and unanimous. Donald Trump was finished. The Republican Party would move past him. The country would heal. A new chapter would begin. The conventional wisdom, as it had done before, dramatically underestimated the man. Following his defeat in the 2020 election to Joe Biden, Trump remained a central figure in American politics, maintaining a strong following within the Republican Party. In November 2022, Trump announced his candidacy for the 2024 presidential election. He ran his 2024 campaign surrounded by legal battles that would have destroyed any other politician. In 2023, he became the first former president to face criminal charges, leading to a series of indictments related to both financial misconduct and efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. And then, on July 13, 2024, came a moment that stopped the world. On July 13, 2024, Trump was shot in the ear in an assassination attempt at a campaign rally in Butler Township, Pennsylvania. The image that emerged from that moment, Trump raising his fist, blood on his face, the crowd roaring behind him, became one of the most iconic photographs in modern American political history. It became a symbol. To his supporters, it was the image of a warrior who could not be stopped. A historic shakeup occurred when Biden announced just 15 weeks before the election that he was dropping out of the race. Vice President Kamala Harris took over as the new Democratic nominee. The campaign became a race between the defiant, battle-tested, legally battered former president and a first-time presidential candidate who had entered the race with less than 4 months to go. Trump won the election in November 2024 with 312 electoral votes to incumbent Vice President Kamala Harris's 226. He also won the popular vote with 49.8% to Harris's 48.3%. Trump defeated Harris and succeeded in becoming the first person to win a non-consecutive term since Grover Cleveland in 1892. Trump began his second term upon his inauguration on January 20th, 2025. The man who had been convicted of felonies, impeached twice, sued in courts across the country, and written off by the entire political establishment had done the unthinkable. Again, history will argue about Donald Trump for a very, very long time. The arguments have already begun, and they show no signs of quieting. They are happening in classrooms and courtrooms, in opinion columns and political science journals, around dinner tables, and in the comments sections of every platform on the internet. His supporters will point to the economic numbers of his first term, the low unemployment rates before the pandemic, the tax cuts, the 3 Supreme Court justices who are now shaping American law for a generation, the trade renegotiations, the Abraham Accords in the Middle East. The historic second election victory that proved his bond with his base was not circumstantial or temporary, but deep and enduring. They will point to the fundamental shift he brought about in Republican politics, away from the globalist, free trade consensus of the Bush era and toward a nationalism and economic populism that genuinely spoke to communities that felt left behind. Regardless of how you feel about the direction, the shift is real and it is lasting. The Republican Party that exists today is substantially different from the one that existed before Donald Trump, and it will carry his imprint for decades. They will point to the millions of people, working-class voters, non-college educated voters, voters who had never participated in the political process before, who felt, for the first time, that someone in Washington was actually speaking for them. Whatever you think of Trump's policies or character, the emotional reality of that connection is not invented. It is documented. It is real. His critics will point to the damage, the division, the 2 impeachments, the January 6th Capitol attack, and the assault on the peaceful transfer of power that is one of democracy's most fundamental rituals. They will point to the coarsening of public discourse, the way that cruelty, mockery, and dishonesty became normalized tools of political debate. They will point to the civil judgments and the criminal conviction and the questions about character that follow him everywhere. They will point to the fractures in institutions, in alliances, in the basic civic fabric of the country, that they argue his presidency deepened rather than healed. After being elected in 2024 for his second term, Trump swiftly moved to consolidate power under the executive branch, upended international trade, and shook up America's global footprint by discarding centuries-old alliances and igniting bombast with Canada, Venezuela, Greenland, and Iran. Trump began his second presidency by initiating mass layoffs of federal workers. He imposed tariffs on nearly all countries at the highest level since the Great Depression. The debate is not going to end. Not in our lifetimes. Possibly not in the lifetimes of our children. Because the questions his presidency raised about democracy, about identity, about who America is and who it is for, these are not small questions. They are the largest questions any democratic society can ask itself. But here is what cannot be debated. Here is what the historical record makes permanent and undeniable. Donald Trump changed American politics. Not adjusted it. Not tweaked it. Changed it. Fundamentally, structurally, perhaps permanently changed it. The norms he broke were real norms. The barriers he crossed were real barriers. And you feel about what was broken and what was crossed. The breaking happened. The crossing happened. And American politics, from this point forward, will have to reckon with the fact that these things are possible. He proved that celebrity is a form of political power. He proved that the institutional gatekeepers of American politics, the party establishments, the major media organizations, the donor networks, could be bypassed if you had enough direct connection to enough people who felt unrepresented. He proved, twice, that the polls can be wrong and the analysts can be wrong and the experts can be wrong, and that the American electorate is capable of producing results that nobody in the establishment was prepared for. And he proved, most of all, that a man can fall from extraordinary heights, be declared finished, be prosecuted, be impeached, be mocked and dismissed and written off, and still come back. Not just come back, but come back stronger. He proved that celebrity is a form of political power. He proved that the institutional gatekeepers of American politics, the party establishments, the major media organizations, the donor networks, could be bypassed if you had enough direct connection to enough people who felt unrepresented. He proved, twice, that the polls can be wrong and the analysts can be wrong and the experts can be wrong, and that the American electorate is capable of producing results that nobody in the establishment was prepared for. And he proved, most of all, that a man can fall from extraordinary heights, be declared finished, be prosecuted, be impeached, be mocked and dismissed and written off, and still come back. Not just come back, but come back stronger. And so we arrive at the end of the story. Except, with Donald Trump, there never really seems to be an end. There is always another chapter, always another act, always another twist that nobody saw coming. He is the boy from Queens who was too loud for the suburbs. The teenager who surprised everyone by thriving in military school. The young man who walked into a broken city and decided to reshape it in his own image. The businessman who built the highest towers and then watched them crumble and then built them again. The television star who became a cultural institution. The political outsider who won the most powerful office on earth. The impeached president who came back. The convicted felon who won a second term. Every time the world has declared him finished, he has proved the world wrong. Every time the conventional wisdom has said this is it, this is too far, this is the end, he has looked at the ceiling above him, reached up, and found another floor. What do we do with a figure like that? How do we measure him? How do we place him in the long story of America and decide what he meant and what he cost and what he gave? The honest answer is, we don't know yet. Not fully. The dust has not settled. The consequences have not all been counted. The Supreme Court justices he appointed will be making decisions for another 30 years. The political movement he built will be contesting elections long after the specific controversies of his presidency have faded from memory. The questions he raised about democracy and power and who gets a voice in this country will be argued about in ways that outlast all of us. What we do know is this. America before Donald Trump and America after Donald Trump are genuinely different places. Not because one man changed everything. No single person changes everything. But because he became the vessel for forces that were already moving through the country. And those forces, the anger, the longing, the sense of cultural displacement and economic abandonment felt by millions, those forces are real. They existed before him. They will exist after him. He gave them a face and a voice and a red hat and a slogan. And in doing so, he revealed something about America that America was not fully prepared to see about itself. Some people look at that revelation and feel pride. Some people feel fear. Some people feel grief. Most people feel some complicated mixture of all three. Donald Trump, the man the world cannot stop talking about, cannot stop arguing about, cannot stop watching. The man who may be the most consequential American political figure of the 21st century, for better and for worse, and for everything in between. Born in Queens, built in Manhattan, defeated, rebuilt, elected, impeached, convicted, re-elected, still here, still fighting, still the most interesting person in every room he has ever walked into. Whether that is a triumph or a warning, that is a question only history can answer. And history, as it turns out, is still being written.